Hey, Mason here. So just wanted to do an update for my character. And currently we are at around 10 billion DPS when ramped, so around 8 to 9 billion DPS. And my character is currently still wearing tier 2 gear. So we just let it run for 10 seconds, and you'll see here that my weapon, tier 2, tier 2, tier 2, tier 2, and the rest of the gear is not that expensive. This is around 100 FE. This one here is around 30 FE, a very underrated helmet that I think is extremely strong. So specifically here, 20 to 40 FE. This one here is a treasure trove item. It is not expensive at all, you can crop this yourself. You see here it's around 10 to 20 FE. This one here is 1 FE. This one here is 15 to 30 FE. Without the corruption, it's 1 to 10 FE. For hero traits, you see here I have one gold hero trait here for block, and then these two are still purples. For slates, I have a 2-mod slate here, Affliction plus any damage mod for this build. This one here is just Affliction. You can just take the talent tree, so this is useless. This one here is just Demolish or Charge. This one, Demolish or Recharge plus the block. You see here, not that expensive. Also not that expensive. Five listings at 5 FE, so not that expensive. Alright, before I forget, I'm just going to show a quick showcase of doing cube with God of War. The reason why I've picked God of War is simply because I like to go extra fast. The build needs enemies nearby for it to get its Demolish or Charge movement speed, which you'll see on the chest piece when I go through the gear. But God of War really does help because it makes you go a lot faster, and you don't really have to worry too much about that. And one thing that's really good about this build is that it actually picks up mobs with the Rosa 1 hero trait. It like grabs them and it drags them along with you, so you can see like the mobs come and they get dragged with me. So it means that you don't really have to backtrack for loot because you just pull the mobs with you. There's some mobs that you can't pull, so for example some of the cube mobs you can't actually pick up for some reason. They have like weird hitboxes or something. But overall most mobs you can just drag with you as you run along. So you pretty much just use God of War to run straight to the boss and click all the cube mobs on the way. Build's also really tanky since it's got 100% in both blocks, as well as 60% block ratio, which I'll just show you here. So it's got, you can see here, it's got both blocks are capped with 60% block ratio, with some armor, so DR from armor, as well as a decent chunk of life with capped res, as well as tenacity blessings, which you gain on block. So the main thing I want to disclaim about the way I'm scaling my damage is you need 2 specific pets, right? I have the Warcry pet, so this build needs the Warcry pet in general. And then you need specifically you need Firewing pet. This is not an attack pet, but I'll show you the tech that I'm using to scale my damage, allowing my Magma helmet to basically double my damage. You see here that with this helmet on, sorry, without this helmet, if I just take this off, I only get to around 5 billion DPS or so with some ramp. So you see it's like 4 to 5 billion DPS. But with the helmet, I'm pretty much doubling my damage. Okay, so there's 2 things that I'm going to talk about. The main thing is about the cost of the build, right? So we showed that the gear is not that expensive, the slates are not that expensive, and then the talents, the hero traits are not that expensive. But the main cost of the build is in these skills, mainly these 3 supports here. These 2 supports are 300 FE each, so 250, 250. This one here is like 200. So these vary a lot depending on the day. And then this one here, specifically for 1.1, is around 100 FE. And you need 2 sets of these to maximize your damage. If you cannot afford the second set, just put a random Warcry in here, because we're using this command, Storm's command here, which gives Warcries more damage, but you can't use them power skills, right? So if you don't have enough money for these 2 links, put Warcry in here, you'll lose maybe 10%, 15% damage also, maybe 20% max. But obviously if you want to min-max damage, you want to have both of these links in here. That's pretty much the primary cost of the build. The rest of the gear, this is the only other thing that could be considered expensive. And the rest of the gear is just very standard, right? Standard links here, just precision auras, and nothing too fancy there. So if you want to find this build and you just want to copy it directly, you can find that with the creator over here. I'm going to add one right now. It's going to be called 10 billion DPS as soon as I finish this with the current snapshot of the character. But I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the theory crafting I went through, the build exploration I went through, and how I ended up with this conclusion and how I ended up solving my damage while still keeping really cheap gear, at least in terms of the actual weapon. So no tier 1 gear at all. Alright, so let's start with dual wielding 2-handers versus 1-hander and a shield. There's pretty much 3 ways that people play this build. The first one is dual wielding, which I can show you quickly in the pro builds here. So the Chinese creator, C, he uses dual wielding. So that's a one-hander, but next. You see here, he's got 2 weapons here, but he doesn't have any Demon's Touch here. Eventually, to scale his damage further, he swaps to Demon's Touch. However, this is extremely expensive because there's a lot of people following him, and so I'm not following this route because it's just too expensive, right? So that's the first way you can scale Rosa's damage. The next way is using a 2-hander. In that case, I'll show you briefly here. This is using a 2-handed weapon alongside Death's Touch. This is a lot cheaper if you don't look at the corruptions. So just non-corrupted is 600, corrupted is 1000. It's still half the price of Demon's Touch. However, this specific creator uses Kregel's Roar, which again is nearly 1000 FE as well. So there's 2 pieces here that are 1000 FE. Meanwhile, on the other setup that C was using, you see that he has 2000 FE here, and I don't think this is that expensive, right? So it's pretty much like kind of the same cost in terms of scaling. So the first thing I wanted to think about is how are these people scaling their damage? The first thing is to talk about is that C uses the Affliction pet here, and a lot of fire builds will use True Flame. This is the primary way we're getting our damage. It is a combination of Magma Skull's new like bonus Affliction effect, so the 20% hit damage, with True Flame right here, and then that effect gets doubled by the Firewing pet, which gives us 120% Affliction, because on the pet tree, it actually gives us 40% Affliction effect here. And then we have to compensate for the downside of Magma Skull. Magma Skull says -6 Affliction per second for every 10% Affliction effect. If we just generically look at the pet itself, this gives us 120%, which means it's taking away a lot of Affliction. And I can easily demonstrate this to you with this specific link in here. This gives me 25 Affliction per second. If I take this out, and I take this out, and then I go hit the dummy, you see that my Affliction is pretty much 0. You see here? It's only 20, 21, 21, whatever, right? It's not ramping to 100, and now it's hitting 0. So we're pretty much not getting any bonus from the helmet, and not getting any bonus from True Flame, simply because of this. This is how the primary way we're pretty much timesing our damage by 3 or 4. Now, when I get enough Affliction effect gain, so when I gain enough Affliction on enemies, specifically through this 25% here, this 25 flat here, you see here that the Affliction is at 100%, and it stays at 100%, my damage ramps as soon as the stuff kicks in, right? So that's the primary way we're scaling our damage. There's a few caveats to this. The main thing is you need ways to gain Affliction, right? You have the first source is Fire Explosion, and then you need 2 specific lines on slates. You need this, plus 18 Affliction per second, plus 18 Affliction per second. You need 2 slates with this mod on it, right? That's it. That's all I have. The rest of the gear doesn't have this, right? Just these 2 slates, and that will give you enough Affliction gain to compensate for a Magma Skull with the Fire Pet here, and with specifically this Talent Tree, which has some Affliction effect here. It's only 45%, but it also gives you Affliction gain, so this kind of counteracts itself because it's -6 for every 10%. So that's kind of how you get around the downside for Magma Skull. And the result is that we have a really, really good scaling build, and I'm really, really happy with how the build turned out. Now, I have a tier 1 weapon here ready to go, but I wanted to make this video with tier 2 gear first. But when you put on the tier 1 weapon, this tier 1 weapon is not optimized. I think it's missing a suffix that could be better, but it hits around 15 to 18 billion DPS, so pretty much doubles my damage, and so we're at 20 bill pretty much now. And of course we have stuff like optimizations here, and some optimizations on slates, specifically the golden ones. I don't have any golden lines, right? I have only purples, so we're keeping it cheap for now. All right, that's pretty much concluding the primary scaling. There's one more thing I wanted to point out is the use of Storm's command here. So Storm's command says you have like no empower effect pretty much, and that's why we could use Tyrant's Smothering Hold here, because it says you can't trigger empower skills. We have 99% reduction effect on empower skills, so we're never going to use them anyways. We'd rather just use Warcries, and so that's why this build gains a lot of effectiveness from using 2 main skills, because they both trigger independently, but we don't really have any extra, like our extra slot does nothing. We can put a Warcry in here for 35% damage, and that's what you'll do before you get a second Groundshaker link. But once you get a second Groundshaker, you just put in 2 Groundshakers to get another 20% damage there. So that's one more thing to keep in mind. If you can't afford 2 sets of these 3 supports, which are the expensive pieces of this build, just put a Warcry in here. Like just any Warcry is fine, right? Shockwave Warcry is what I was using. It literally doesn't matter. The text on it doesn't matter. We're using it for the 35% more damage that comes from the Storm's Command talent node. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the theoretical and a checklist on what you need to upgrade to get from this stage to the next one. But let's first start with the weapon type. So there's 3 ways this build is played. There's dual wielding, there's two-hander, and there's a one-hander and a shield. Once you get to deep space, pretty much everyone plays a one-hander and a shield because it's like kind of the default best setup, right? But you need very expensive pieces on your shield. So what this looks like in game, I'll just first show you the two-hander setup. The two-hander setup is probably what I'm going to start with. So over here, two-hander setup is this person here. You see here he's using a two-hander setup plus Death's Touch, and Death's Touch with this corruption is around 1000 FE. Without the corruption, it's like half that price. And he's using Kraggle's Roar here, which also is another 1000 FE helmet. Now the the dual wielding setup, you'll see this right here. It is pretty much dual wielding weapons here with Demon's Touch, and Demon's Touch is a 2000 FE pair of gloves. So very expensive, but very, very strong because of the way Conspire works. It pretty much just sums your two-handed weapons together, and you get the bonus for dual wielding, which is 30% attack block for free, pretty much, no downside. And then the final setup is what I'm going to eventually be transitioning to, but maybe not at this stage because it's quite expensive, is the one-handed setup that people use for deep space. It is a combination of a one-handed mace or hammer plus a shield with +3 active skill levels, and both of these combined together give a ton of damage, which allows you to run Trinity because it turns your elemental max res into pen pretty much, and you can get max res on a shield and go slaughter for further effect stacking with a Vorax helm with further perma fervor. So that's the endgame setup. Those are the 3 main core setups I've saw for attack scaling on Rosa 1. And I'll put this spreadsheet in below. You can have a look at them yourself, right? So this is the profound setups for Demon's Touch, Death's Touch, and then a profound setup for Trinity, and then a deep space setup for Trinity. However, most people seem to transition to Shield for Trinity, for deep space, because you need the defensive requirement. It's so high that other setups can't meet it. Okay, so here's the general gist of these 3 types of setups. Two-hander is the best for early progression because you get the most damage, right? Simply because Join Forces is not super optimal. It adds 60% of the damage of your offhand to your main weapon, right? And then it just means your offhand does nothing. So it's pretty much a stat padding. Your offhand becomes a stat padder for your main weapon. That's what this specific mod here does. Dual wielding is good early because it caps your attack block because you get 30% passive attack block from the dual wielding bonus, but you lose out on damage. So when I tested the damage for my character, two-hander was doing more damage, around 20%, 30% more. Dual wielding was doing 70% of the damage of a two-hander. And a one-hander and a shield is garbage until you can get ultimate shield mods. You need the ultimate shield mods, specifically +3 attack skills. Otherwise, it's very, very hard to get damage with the one-hander and a shield early game, right? So here's the main general gist. Two-hander is really good for early game progression, and it's cheaper for damage. Dual wielding is good, but you need Demon's Touch, which is really expensive for scaling damage for profound. And one-hander shield is great, but you need ultimate mods, which makes it expensive. That's the first part. So in the end, I'm settling with a two-hander for now, and I'm probably going to push to profound with a two-hander, and then eventually I'm going to swap over to the one-hander and a shield setup for deep space if I keep pushing this character further. Now, the next part is talking about conversion. Previously, I was playing cold conversion using Varagon's Lament, and cold conversion is really, really strong early game, but it falls off around once you get to tier 8 or so. So if I quickly just pull up my previous creation, which I think was this one here. You see here, I'm playing Varagon's Lament, and specifically I'm playing the Prophet Tree here, and I'm playing this node right here, which converts 100% fizz to cold damage. Now, conversion is really strong because it gives you Frostbite, and what Frostbite does is it gives us flat damage. You see here, it gives us, for every 1 Frostbite rating, we get 1% additional cold damage taken, and you can cap this at around 110% Frostbite, and that's really, really strong, but there's a few hoops you need to hop through. The first one is you need max Frostbite rating. This specific chest piece gives me 30 of it, and then this node gives me 50 of it. The base, I think, is 10, so there's some more Frostbite on the tree as well. So pretty much, this gives us to get me to 110 Frostbite, which is 110% increased damage taken for cold damage. Now, if I quickly show you the bats tier, you see here, 110% Frostbite rating. If you have Frostbitten, like the node, gives you 154% more damage. but it costs a pedigree or a blending slot on your belt. Now, what makes fire conversion so strong is simply that the opportunity cost on gear is so much less than cold conversion if you have the Firewing pet. So the main way, again, I showed you before how you scale your fire conversion is specifically through this node here, which turns our Affliction into extra hit damage. 60% of the Affliction effect turns into hit damage. And then we're scaling Affliction effect here, and we're scaling Affliction effect on the pet. This one here gives us 120% because it has these small nodes here. And that results in us giving a ton more Affliction effect, which again doubles the effect right here. This effect right here, it pretty much doubles the damage. And then we're double dipping into this Affliction effect with a Magma Skull, and then we're sustaining the minus Affliction per second using the specific support I showed you on your Fire Explosion here, and 2 slates with Affliction per second gain, Affliction per second gain, right? So that's how we're kind of getting around the downsides for Magma Skull, and then we're scaling a ton of damage through Affliction, which gives us a lot more damage without costing as much gear. In the end, you see here that without any cost, just the node on the tree and the pet gives us 140% more damage, like no cost, but compared to the 110% from Frostbite rating, which then requires you to get max Frostbite rating as well. So you need like around 30, so either ring suffixes or on Varagon's Lament, and you need Frostbitten to get even competitive, right? So in the end, fire conversion ends up resulting in more damage for less cost, and that's why I've converted over to fire conversion, and I think mathematically it's the correct thing to do if you want to scale this build efficiently, which is how I've shown so far. Now, I have a section here for Trinity. I'm not going to talk about it because I haven't really scaled Trinity, but Trinity itself gives you 2 things. It gives you Elemental Pen equal to your minimum effective res, which is 60% baseline, and then it gives you Law of Trinity, which makes it so every elemental hit is guaranteed to deal 5x elemental damage. So just these 2 mods together is 60% more damage times 500% more, 400% more damage, right? 60 plus, I'm not sure how it multiplies, but it's a lot of damage for just 1 item slot. And it's pretty much how you should think about Torchlight Infinite item scaling. So that pretty much covers the main way we're scaling. So again, when I tested, 2-hander gave me the most damage, so I picked 2-hander. And then when I tested, fire conversion gave me the most damage, so I've swapped over to fire conversion. And the main thing with 2-hander that you need to solve is getting block. And so getting block is pretty easy because all you need is block here, right? Attack block, spell block, and then that allows me to cap both my blocks again. So you see here, block plus block, both capped. And that's because we're taking the Sentinel tree for defenses, right? If you want to get even more damage, you can take Last Stand here, and it turns all your block into more damage. And you see here that we can get up to like nearly, probably like 20 billion DPS or so. I think this is with the really good weapon though. Yeah, if I swap over to the other weapon, I think it was around a 17 billion or 18 billion DPS. Let's have a look, 15 maybe. But pretty much you gain a ton more damage, but with sacking, it's 50% more damage. So here, around 16 billion DPS. But with sacking, I'm sacking this one for defenses. I want more defenses, so instead I'm dropping this. I'm taking the block ratio in order to get my defenses up. So again, 2-handers for the most damage, and fire conversion results in the most damage. So I swapped over to both of these. Cold conversion again is only good because Varagon's Lament is very, very cheap in the early game. But if you have this pet, you probably should just swap to fire damage anyways, because it just gives you more damage on paper. Now, here's a checklist for what I upgraded to get to this stage. The first thing is the Groundshaker supports, an activation medium, precise auras, and then the fire conversion stuff. So these 3 again, I showed you before. The Groundshaker supports are these 2, right? Before I only had one of them, now I bought this one as well. Activation medium automates the build, so we don't have to use the jumping support, which is Groundshaker Wrath. And so that allows me to, it automatically activates when I'm just walking around, and I now have auto channeling on this one right here. I have auto channeling activated, as well as the auto channeling activated in the settings right here. So I auto walk when I press my C key to activate the aura. And then it sucks all the mobs in as well, which makes the playstyle very, very comfortable. The next thing is the fire conversion stuff, which I discussed before. The steps that you actually need to do for this is pretty straightforward. You swap Prophet over to Warlord, you click the tree as shown here. The main thing you need to click is Fire Convert here. You click Fire Infiltration here if you don't have this on your slate. Again, this is the most important thing. You click True Flame here, and then you put on the pet, and you should be good to go. And then if you want to eventually put on Magma Skull as well for even more damage, then you need to make sure that your support links have specifically Fire Explosion here. And then on your slates, you want to make sure that you have 2 sources of Affliction gain on the slates, And it turns out this mod's the best because it has the minus all res when they have max affliction, right? So that damage wise, this mod ends up being the best for having also giving us affliction gain. So that's the fire conversion here. Now I'm using Tyrant's Smoldering, and that's because Tyrant's Smoldering now gives us flat fire, so we can fire now, right? We can actually get benefit from this flat damage. But the main thing here is that because we're unable to trigger Empower skills, that's really good synergy with Storm's Command, which makes our Empower skills have pretty much no effect. So because we can't really use Empower skills anyways because of Storm's Command, we might as well get the free lucky crit from these gloves that cost 1 FE because we don't care about the Empower skill. Now, I mentioned before, again, if you can't afford 2 links, so if you can't afford the second one, you just put in any Warcry in here, and it's simply for Storm's Command for this specific 35% damage boost. And then here's where the main issue for the build came in. The build is very, very slow once you swap it over to an activation medium. So right here on instruction, and I'll just demonstrate you this by just walking around. You see here that if this is in a map, this is extremely slow. If we're clearing, this is our speed of clear, this is really, really slow. We have no mobility skills at all. So my next idea is that I need to figure out how to make this build fast and comfortable to play in mapping, and there's a few solutions for that. The first one that I've seen is extremely, extremely expensive. It is a specific Kitsman on Destinies, and this specific one gives speed when you use a Demolish Charge. I think it's in the melee tag, might be the big one. Apologies for that cut, it's right here, this one. 45% movement speed when consuming a Demolish Charge that runs at a time. This is really expensive, Jewel Kismet's Shackles. It's like 800 FE or so. So that's one thing I didn't want to pay for speed, and so I ended up remembering that I used this before and it was really bad, but with the Corruption, it gives us 100% movement speed when we consume a Demolisher Charge, and we're always proccing our Demolisher skill, which is once every second. And so this gives us and solves our movement speed. You see here that without it, I'm very, very slow. And with it, we're a lot faster, a lot more manageable, and it plays a lot nicer in maps. So that's the next thing to do. Because of the activation medium, we're now using Furious Man Body to solve specifically our movement speed. And so that gives us a lot more comfortable, like it makes playing the build a lot better. Now, the next thing briefly is the Dream Affix. And then because we're using so many uniques, so you see here that we're using so many uniques in our slots, we can't really cap res with tier 2 res mods. So the way I'm getting around this is simply with Kismet. We have some lightning res here, some cold and fire res here, and some fire res here, and that's it, right? That caps our res. A few things you want to note is that you don't want to remove the affliction effect here. This is the one thing you don't want to remove. And the Warcry effect is useful here, and the rest of it's all kind of relevant. The only one that's not really that relevant is attack speed, so you can also remove that one there, right? And the duration is somewhat relevant, but I think you can still meet the requirements for permanent Warcries without this duration. So that's pretty much the step-by-step upgrades here, and then we get to the part about Magma Skull. I've already mentioned this before, you need 2 slates with 18 affliction per second. So 18 affliction is the one with the best amount of damage. So you need 2 slates, and you also need fire affliction, or not fire affliction, fire explosion in here for the affliction per second. And then because I'm using a 2-hander from swapping up before, I end up using a yellow memory for block cap. So again, I showed this earlier as well. It's just this one here. And that allows me to get block cap. That's pretty much it. So there's a few things in my skill tree that I will just briefly point out. I'm using, for example, I'm using some regen nodes here. You can take these off for more damage if you want more damage. I like the extra regen, although I don't really know how significant it is. It feels like pretty useful. So that's one thing to note. And and I've been asked if this build can do God of Might, and God of Might has a really large degen, but you can actually do it if you have a slate, specifically with either defensiveness or full defense, and then you take the other one on the tree, and this gives you a massive damage over time reduction, 60% less damage over time taken. It's huge. So that's why this regen, I was using this regen because I was going to try farming God of Might, and there's a massive degen that you need regen to counteract. And the final upgrade again was the Groundshaker links, which is again the most expensive. So that's kind of a list of all the upgrades from 1 build to 10 build from my previous video to now. And that's all I've done on my character. And overall, this character has served me very, very well. I'm going to keep playing this character. Again, we're going to give him the new weapon. This was like 300 FE, surprisingly. Pretty cheap. You can see here that I bought this for 328 FE, and it gives me double damage. So I'm nearly 220 build DPS, and with a little bit more upgrades, like for example, my slates are not done yet, I should be able to get 220 build, 25 build, and Traveler should be very, very straightforward and super easy, especially with a build this tanky because it's got heaps of block. See here, we've got double block, 60% DR, we've got mitigation here, we've got tenacity blessings which are not active, and so we're generally very, very tanky, and then we have a bunch of life on block, life recovery, etc. Okay, so I'm going to put this in the description below if you're interested in the builds and the discussion. Again, most of this is just theory crafting that I've theory crafted in terms of numbers and efficiency from my PoE knowledge, and I'm going to keep scaling this character. Eventually we're going to get to profound soon, probably within another 1,000 to 2,000 FE, and then we're going to try and look towards deep space setups with the shield and the one-hander once we get to that certain stage, and I'll keep making content covering this build. Okay, thanks for watching, and if you have any questions, chuck it below, and I'm out.